Hey there, welcome back for another deep dive.
Always exciting.
Today we're tackling a topic that's both personal and complex. Views on masturbation in Islam.
Okay.
We had a listener,
Yeah.
you reach out with some really thoughtful questions.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought this would be like the perfect opportunity to explore those diverse perspectives.
Yeah. It's definitely a topic that sparks a lot of curiosity
Yeah,
and often gets shrouded in misunderstanding.
exactly. And to help us navigate this, sensitive terrain, we're turning to insights from Dr. Zakir Naik,
Okay.
a prominent Islamic scholar.
Yes.
Shared in one of his lectures.
He's known for breaking down complex theological issues
Yeah.
in a way that's both insightful and accessible.
Before we jump in, though,
Yeah.
I think it's super important to acknowledge that we're here to learn and understand,
Of course.
not to judge or preach.
Mm-hmm.
There's a rich diversity of thought within Islam, and our goal is to explore those nuances with respect and an open mind.
Absolutely. And when it comes to masturbation in Islam, there isn't one monolithic viewpoint.
Yeah.
In fact, Dr. Naik, he outlines three main stances that have been debated by scholars for centuries.
Yeah.
Haraam, Makrooh, and Mubah.
Okay, so let's break down these terms. I know they might sound a little foreign to some folks.
Yeah, think of them as points on a spectrum.
Okay.
Haram is the most stringent, meaning something is strictly forbidden, no ifs, ands, or buts.
Okay.
Then we have Makrooh, which is more like discouraged or frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gray area there, and it's generally seen as something to avoid if possible.
Okay.
And finally, we have Mubah, which means permissible. It's left up to individual choice and circumstance.
Wow, so right off the bat, we see that there's room for different interpretations.
Exactly.
Not a black and white issue.
Exactly. And what's refreshing about Dr. Naik's approach is that he presents all three viewpoints, acknowledging this diversity of thought within Islamic scholarship.
Now I'm curious, what are the key texts or arguments that have led to these different interpretations?
Mm-hmm.
I imagine there are specific passages in the Quran or Hadith that come into play.
You're spot on. A central point of discussion revolves around a verse from the Quran. Surah Al-Mu'minun, verses 5 to 7.
Okay.
This verse speaks about safeguarding one's modesty and has been subject to different interpretations.
I bet. It sounds like one of those verses that requires careful consideration of the context and nuances of the language.
Exactly. One interpretation views this verse as a blanket prohibition of all forms of sexual gratification outside the bounds of marriage, which, of course, would include masturbation.
That makes sense given the emphasis on preserving sexual purity within the marital bond.
However, another interpretation focuses more specifically on the act of sexual intercourse,
Okay.
suggesting that the verse primarily addresses that particular act and might not explicitly cover other forms of sexual activity like masturbation.
So it's a matter of how broadly one interprets the language and scope of that verse. And I'm guessing Dr. Naik leans towards the latter interpretation.
You got it. He sees the verse as primarily addressing intercourse and doesn't view it as a direct prohibition of masturbation. But of course, it wouldn't be a deep dive if we start there, right?
You know me too well.
Right.
There's always more to uncover.
Always.
What other pieces of the puzzle are there?
Well, besides the Quran, we have the Hadith,
Right.
which are collections of sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. These serve as important sources of guidance for Muslims.
Right. They offer practical examples of how Islamic principles can be applied in daily life.
Exactly. And there's one particular hadith that comes up frequently in discussions about masturbation. In it, the Prophet encourages young people to get married as a means of channeling their sexual desires
Okay.
in a healthy and permissible way.
Yeah.
And if marriage isn't feasible at the time, he suggests fasting as a way to manage those urges.
Interesting. So how does this hadith factor into the debate on masturbation?
Well, this is where things get a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
Some scholars interpret this hadith as indirectly prohibiting masturbation, since it wasn't presented as an alternative alongside marriage or fasting. The logic being that if it was permissible, the Prophet would have explicitly mentioned it.
Ah, so it's a matter of what's implied versus what's stated directly.
Precisely. But other scholars argue that the hadith doesn't address masturbation directly at all
Okay.
and focuses solely on providing guidance for managing strong sexual desires. They contend that absence of mention doesn't automatically equate to prohibition.
That's a good point. It seems like there's room for debate on how to interpret the Prophet's intentions in that specific hadith.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
this is where individual scholarly opinions and interpretations come into play.
Okay.
You have some prominent scholars, like Ibn Abbas, a companion of the Prophet, who viewed masturbation as being preferable to engaging in fornication.
So in his view, it was a lesser of two evils, suggesting a degree of permissibility.
Exactly. Then you have scholars like Imam Abu Hanifa and Ibn Hazm who fall into the Makrooh camp.
Okay.
They discouraged masturbation, but didn't see it as outright forbidden.
It sounds like they recognized the potential downsides, but didn't view it with the same severity as haram acts.
Right. And to add another layer to this already fascinating spectrum of opinions, we have scholars like Imam Sharani, who lived a few centuries ago and actually considered masturbation to be mubah, entirely permissible.
Wow, so even within the realm of Islamic scholarship, there's a wide range of viewpoints on this.
It is.
It's definitely not as simple as some might assume.
And that's what makes this topic so intriguing.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think critically and to appreciate the complexity of religious interpretation.
It's not just about finding a single right answer,
Right.
but about understanding the different perspectives and engaging with them thoughtfully.
Exactly. And that's what makes Dr. Naik's perspective particularly interesting. He actually delves into both the religious and medical aspects of the debate, which adds another layer to the discussion.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Sure.
What kind of medical insights does he bring into this discussion?
Well, he starts by acknowledging the findings of modern medical research,
Okay.
which indicate that masturbation is a relatively common practice among both men and women.
So he's grounding his analysis in both traditional Islamic knowledge and contemporary scientific understanding.
Yes, and he makes it clear that while masturbation might be statistically common, it doesn't necessarily mean it aligns with what's considered the norm or ideal from an Islamic perspective.
That's a really important distinction to make. Just because something is prevalent doesn't automatically make it religiously sanctioned.
Exactly. And he also tackles some of the common myths and misconceptions surrounding masturbation,
Okay.
like the idea that it causes physical harm.
Mm-hmm.
He points out that scientific evidence doesn't support those claims
Yep.
and emphasizes that, like with many things in life, it's excessive indulgence that can potentially lead to negative consequences rather than the act itself.
It's refreshing to hear a religious scholar addressing those myths head-on and incorporating a balanced perspective.
Absolutely.
And it shows his willingness to engage with both traditional wisdom and contemporary knowledge.
Right.
But I know you're probably wondering, where does Dr. Naik ultimately land on this spectrum of opinions?
Well, I think that's a great place to transition into part 2.
Stay tuned, because in part 2, we'll cover exactly where Dr. Naik lands.
And much more.
See you there.
Welcome back to our deep dive into perspectives on masturbation in Islam. Last time we left off with this fascinating spectrum of interpretations from Islamic scholars throughout history.
Right, and we were just about to get to where Dr. Zakir Naik falls on that spectrum.
Okay, so before we get too deep into Dr. Naik's conclusion, I think it's important to acknowledge the elephant in the room.
Which is, how much cultural and personal baggage we all bring to any discussion
Mhm.
about sex and sexuality.
Oh, absolutely. It's like we're all wearing these invisible glasses that filter how we see the world and process information.
Yeah, and when you add in the sensitivity around sexuality,
Yeah,
things get even more intricate.
for sure.
Because, what might be considered a casual conversation in one culture
Mm.
could be totally taboo in another.
Right.
And those differences in openness definitely play a role in how people understand and relate to religious teachings.
Absolutely. Like, imagine a culture where open dialogues about sex are pretty common. Even within a religious framework, people might feel more comfortable, exploring a wider range of interpretations, questioning traditional views, figuring out what resonates with them personally.
It's like having more breathing room to grapple with complex issues without the fear of judgment or stigma.
Exactly. But in a culture where those conversations are hushed or considered inappropriate, people might be more likely to stick to stricter, more literal interpretations of religious texts.
Yeah.
There might be less room for nuance or individual exploration.
It's almost as if the cultural context itself becomes like an unspoken part of the interpretation.
Precisely. It's not just about the words on the page, but also the unwritten rules and societal norms that influence how those words are understood and applied.
And that makes me think about our own personal experiences too.
Yeah.
Like how our upbringing, our family dynamics, or even past relationships might color our understanding of these sensitive topics.
That's such an important point. It's like we're all weaving together threads of religious doctrine, cultural influences, personal beliefs, and individual experiences to create our own unique understanding of faith.
It's almost like a tapestry, right?
Uh,
And sometimes it can be hard to separate those threads and see where one influence ends and another begins.
Absolutely.
So self-awareness becomes really crucial here, like recognizing that we're not just objective observers, but active participants in this process of interpretation,
Totally.
and that we all have biases
Yeah.
and preconceived notions that we bring to the table, and that's okay.
It is, yeah.
It's part of what makes us human.
What's fascinating here is that this dynamic isn't limited to Islam or even religion in general.
Oh, for sure.
It applies to how we interpret any text, whether it's a piece of literature, a historical document, or even a news article.
We all bring our own baggage to the table, and it inevitably shapes our understanding. It's a humbling realization, but also an empowering one.
It is, because once we become aware of those influences, we can start to question them, challenge them, and even use them to enrich our understanding.
It's about turning those limitations into opportunities for growth and deeper insight.
Exactly. And when we apply that to our discussion on masturbation in Islam, it encourages us to approach those different interpretations with more empathy and understanding.
Instead of simply dismissing a viewpoint that differs from ours, we can try to see it through the lens of that person's cultural background and personal experiences.
It's about recognizing that there isn't one right answer, but rather a spectrum of understanding shaped by a multitude of factors.
And that diversity of thought is something to be celebrated, not feared. It enriches our understanding of faith and helps us connect with others on a deeper level.
It's the beauty of being human, right?
Yeah.
To embrace those differences and learn from each other's perspectives.
So what advice would you give to our listener who's trying to navigate this complex landscape of interpretations on masturbation in Islam?
Okay.
Considering all these cultural and personal influences.
I think first and foremost, I'd encourage them to approach this journey with an open mind.
Yeah.
And a spirit of genuine curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be afraid to ask those tough questions. Seek out diverse viewpoints. And be willing to sit with the discomfort of ambiguity.
It's not about finding a quick and easy answer, but about embarking on a process of self-discovery and thoughtful engagement.
Exactly. And it's equally important to seek out reliable sources of information.
Oh, yeah.
It's easy to get lost in the sea of opinions online. So finding guidance from knowledgeable scholars and reputable Islamic institutions can be invaluable.
Yeah, they can provide a solid foundation and help you navigate those complex theological nuances.
But ultimately, it's about finding what resonates with you personally, within the framework of your own faith and values. It's a deeply individual journey.
Yeah.
And there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
It's about honoring your own unique path and seeking understanding that aligns with your heart and mind.
Beautifully said.
And welcome back. I feel like we could talk for hours about how personal experiences and cultural backgrounds affect how we view just about everything.
Oh, totally.
But I think it's time to circle back and really try to understand, kind of distill what Dr. Naik is saying about masturbation in Islam.
Yeah, good point.
So to recap, so far we've learned there's not one single right interpretation in Islam.
Right, it's much more nuanced than that.
So where does Dr. Naik land?
Well, after looking at all of the evidence, Dr. Naik concludes that masturbation is makrooh.
Makrooh.
Yeah, remember, that means it's discouraged but not strictly forbidden.
Right. That was like the middle ground.
Yeah.
More discouraged than mubah, but not outright haram.
Exactly.
Okay, so why does he land there? What's his reasoning?
Well, his conclusion is based on a few key things.
Okay.
First, he points out that neither the Quran nor authentic hadiths explicitly forbid masturbation.
So it's not like a clear-cut haram issue.
Right. Secondly, he says that while there's no clear prohibition, there is concern about the potential negative consequences of excessive masturbation.
I see.
Especially when it's linked to things like pornography.
Okay, so too much of anything can be bad.
Exactly.
Even something that isn't, inherently wrong could become problematic if it's taken to an extreme. That makes sense. So that's two reasons not explicitly haram, but potential for negative consequences if it's not kept in check. What's the third reason?
His third point is that Islam offers healthier and more fulfilling ways to channel those desires, primarily through marriage.
Right, and if marriage isn't an option, fasting is suggested.
Exactly. It's not about just suppressing those urges, but about redirecting them in ways that are more aligned with Islamic values and that promote overall well-being.
I mean, that seems like a recurring theme across a lot of different faith traditions, right? Like, it's not just about saying no to certain things, but about seeking something positive and fulfilling.
Totally. It's about finding that balance.
Okay, so to sum it up, Dr. Naik lands on Makrooh because there's no explicit prohibition, but there are concerns about potential harm from excess, and because Islam encourages channeling sexual desires through marriage and fasting.
Right.
It's about approaching it all with a sense of mindfulness and balance.
Mm.
I think it's remarkable how much we've learned from just one lecture by Dr. Naik. Like, this one question has opened up so many different avenues of thought.
I know. And it highlights just how much our own cultural and personal experiences can influence our perspectives on sensitive topics.
Absolutely.
We've learned about those three main stances on masturbation within Islam, how different scholars interpret key texts, and how cultural norms can shape our understanding.
And most importantly, we've touched upon the significance of approaching these topics with respect, open-mindedness, and a willingness to learn.
Right. It's not about finding one right answer,
Yeah.
but about understanding the diversity of thought and engaging in these discussions thoughtfully and respectfully.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what key takeaways would you say our listeners can carry with them as they continue to explore their own understanding?
I think a big one is that there's no shame in asking questions and seeking knowledge. It's okay to be curious and to grapple with these complex issues.
Curiosity is a good thing.
It is. Also, remember there are resources out there, like reputable scholars and Islamic institutions that can help you navigate these complex topics.
But ultimately, your understanding is your own. It's a personal journey of faith, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. It's about finding what resonates with you within the framework of your own beliefs and values.
And don't forget the importance of being open-minded and respectful of different interpretations.
Even if they differ from your own.
Because there's beauty in that diversity of thought. And it's through those respectful dialogues that we can truly enrich our understanding of faith.
Well said.
So to our listener who sent in that thought-provoking question, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You sparked a truly fascinating discussion, and hopefully we provided some food for thought as you continue on your journey of seeking knowledge and understanding.
I think we did.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.
Until next time, keep exploring.